Yes, wonderful papers. My question is for Annabel, but the place it comes from is a moment in which Nick ended his paper, "The written I can never be the writing I." We kind of know this in a sense. We've been rehearsing it for like 2 days. We all believe it, and yet I kind of want to ask Annabel this. I mean, part of me loved your critique of Carrère, but I also think that there's whose work I don't know. In fact, I should specify that. But I also detected a tension in your paper, and the tension was, what is the real kind of what is the real bête noire of your? Is it really Carrère, or is it really the ways in which he has been read? I mean, you yourself insisted on a crucial set of principles for reading him. Carrère is obviously a screen. His work is obviously a form of mediation. He is being treated as an ideal mirror, but of course he isn't one. The distortion itself is being treated as the real. I mean, these are things that you said, and yet in your critique of his project, there's a dimension of in which you are yourself also sort of forgetting that. So I wondered whether you can imagine a world in which Carrère is no longer tied to the frame in which he presents his own work. Is it possible that there might be a way of insisting upon something like a kind of mediated reading of his project, where he himself becomes readable as a Trojan horse, in the way that you read Angaretta, for example? That he himself is. I mean, what is there to guarantee, let's say, in his eye, that the I should be taken as a far more simple I than perhaps or you than perhaps we see operating elsewhere? So that's my question.
Thank you, Tim. I think that I thank you for and Nicholas for the reminder of the written I cannot be the writing I, which I think you're absolutely right to say that I do kind of collapse the two in allowing Carrère to be self-identical in that way. But the reason why I shudder at the thought of doing the kind of Trojan horse reading for Carrère that I do for Angaretta is, I think, because of, and this might not be admissible, or legitimate, but I think it's because of the kind of, I guess, paraliterary commentary that they have on the self, right? As in, Garetta is continually kind of skeptical of the self, of the fantasy that readers often have, that there is an actual I to be found in the text, whereas Carrère seems really happy for his readers, for the French public, to say, oh yes, this is me, this is Carrère. I mean, like Anne's work, she's so kind of committed to the idea that no subject expresses itself in any narration that she just shies away entirely from the first person in Pas un jour as a, really kind of very visible reminder that the written I, cannot be the writing I. But Carrère, I think he has no investment in sort of training his readers to be more critical. I think he depends on his readers being these kind of, I don't know, the naive is not quite their word, but credulous. He's happy to reinforce their fantasy, and I find that to be utterly. And again, I think part of what makes me nervous about the project I'm working on right now is it's hard for me to disentangle the aesthetic from the moral, because I think it's kind of obvious to all of you that I sort of object to Carrère on moral grounds. So I'm not quite sure what to do with it. I think that there's a kind of like paradox at work, kind of like with that, the sort of the mind, the sort of self-contradiction of like, oh, you know, someone who says, like Pinocchio, who's going to say, my nose will disappear. And in which it cannot be truth, it cannot be a lie. And I feel like Carrère has done something similar. So I wish for there to be a possibility to have the kind of mediated reading. I think that would allow me to be able to disentangle myself from the like literary swamp that I think Carrère has created. But Carrère has basically set up his whole literary project on this self kind of destructing, incoherent position.
I'm sorry, but this is really urgent for me. What I liked, first I'm going to try to address what Annabel said, and I'm going to draw direct political implications. It seems to me that the logic underlying Carrère's appeal is exactly the logic which is underlying Donald Trump's con game, i.e. the raging malignant narcissist being mistaken for a Christ-like sacrificial figure. And it doesn't matter whether they're illiterate when it comes to the Bible or to any religious notion. It works. So I would have a kind of Marxist reading of that, not in the sense of Karl Marx, but of Groucho Marx. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? That's the con. Now, the question is not the con itself. The question is, why would readers, why would people anywhere, voters, citizens, fall for this transparently grifting, obscene, unredeemable and unreparable con? There's no reparative reading to be had of any of this. It's bad, bad, bad to the bone. And the consequences, political and aesthetic, and aesthetico-political, are considerable. So the question is, when we read, the only reparative reading is, when we read Carrère, can we detect the mechanisms whereby the con can become visible? Can reading Carrère, despite the disgust it produces in you, in me, and possibly others, can it teach us something about how that grift, that con, that masquerade, that abuse of trust and power takes place? Can you detect something? That's the only reparation I can envision here. Now that I've taken that off of my... I would say this was a really interesting... it was a really interesting panel. I liked, Lauren, the pictures. The pictures you took of that landscape, this flatness of landscape, of parking lots, of lights and sunsets is absolutely beautiful. And I found it very poignant that you tried to understand from the inside how a conspiracy theory can take place. What is it that you notice that starts affecting your brain and that is going to prime your brain to see the truckers' conspiracy somewhere? And it's also an uncanny moment when you see what you know for a fact to not be the fact suddenly become a fact. That's the uncanny in the true sense that Nicholas here reiterated and pointed out. So I think this entire panel is about the uncanny. How can you see something transforming into its opposite? And how do you diagnose the transformations, the flipping of things up on, like that? I mean, I was quite struck and impacted by what I've heard this afternoon. So how do you diagnose it? What do you do with this suddenly it becomes something else? all suddenly have been captured into a pronoun, into a gaze.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the case of my work, the postdoc research, I do appreciate. I hadn't thought of it as the uncanny, but I do think that's a really generative way to think about it. In terms of seeing something transforming into its opposite, I think that in the case of the work I was doing, it's transforming into its opposite while still retaining some traces of the original. So I think that there is that. I mean, yeah, that uncanny kind of moment. Is it fact or fiction? Is it this kind of absurd invention, or is it actually pointing to something in the real world? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And thank you, Anne, for, I think, really articulating very forcefully what it is that bothers me so much about Carrère. And so I'm going to add on to my response to your first question, Tim, because it would not. The problem is that Carrère has hijacked the label of literature for himself. Carrère has a history as a journalist. I would have no problem if he published all of these books as just nonfiction, but it's that he insists on there being nonfiction novels. And so because of the kind of history of the novel being a really kind of prestigious form of literature in France, that people are reading his nonfiction that he says are novels and thinking, oh, this is the literary experience. When there's so much more interesting literature happening in France that does not get read, that does not get celebrated, that does not get thought about. And so instead we find ourselves in a situation where if we are going to be able to understand the mechanisms by which this, horrible, I guess Carrère's car would be like a Humvee, it's when we're already been run over by it. And I do feel like that is kind of what French literature, contemporary French literature seems like to me, is the worst kind of car, and it has just steamrolled. So that, yeah, we can have clarity on the situation, and we can diagnose it, but what are we going to do when that car has literally run us over and immobilized us in the whole literary field?
Peter? Thank you. I have a question or comment for you, Nicholas. I wanted to take very seriously one of the things you insisted upon in your talk, one of the motifs, which was the turn. So you talked about a U-turn, but the figure of the turn was also very present throughout your talk. And I couldn't help hearing something pleonastic in the very idea of a U-turn. I mean that every time there is a U, something is addressed to someone, it's already a turning towards. And yet I also thought that what was so powerful in your talk was that in the end it was me or I that appeared as a turn. When you talked about waking up to a pronoun, as if the very possibility of saying I or me would be a turn also, turning towards. It's just a thought, not really a question, but maybe you want to elaborate or say something more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Partly because of previous talks, I'm very struck by a kind of aporia. I've already started speaking in the first person, but
is your microphone on?
I think you just need to bring it closer.
Yeah. Sorry, I've already, wrecked everything by speaking in the first person in answer to your question, and I feel very uneasy about doing this. I have wondered about what would really be the appropriate pronoun in which to respond to a question about the talk. I was attempting to do so in the they form, but I've already fallen into the I. Though that doesn't necessarily mean I'm fully awake. Yeah, the U-turn I stumbled on as I was writing, and obviously it's a terrible pun or homonym of some kind. I'm very struck by how cars have just, featured in so many of our presentations. And obviously there's a lot to say about that, but I don't think of the U-turn as a Y-O-U turn. Okay, that's the word, the neologism. The U-turn, as I'm formulating it, I suppose is not necessarily a turning towards. I'm very interested in veering. This is a subject of a book from 2011. I'm very interested in the uncertainty of veering and what the movement of veering is, whether in relation to an automobile or desire or thinking, or the environment, of course, because for me, the question of the environment is the question of veering, and the book Veering is based on the French verb virer in the word environment. So thinking about the human in relation to the environment is to ask a question about the nature of veering. So I liked the emphasis this morning on what Kevin was talking about as a gesturing towards, and I certainly don't want to dissociate myself from that benign sense of movement, but I'm not sure whether that's necessarily what the U-turn entails. I don't know whether that begins to respond to your question, but I wonder, maybe I could pick up on something that Anne was saying yesterday, because in some ways I have the sense that little clip from The Matrix, which you, Anne, insisted as being in some sense encapsulating all of our concerns. And I loved what you said about it, and I found the clip itself extraordinary, and it's been replaying in my head. Déjà vu is something which greatly interests me, and I've written about it on at least 2 occasions. There are 2 chapters of my book, The Uncanny, called Déjà vu. There'd have to be 2 chapters. But what got me interested in the notion of déjà vu in part was the fact that in the psychopathology of everyday life, Freud says at some point that we must include in the theory of the uncanny the phenomenon of déjà vu. And then in his essay on the uncanny, he doesn't talk about it. So this is what I tried to write about in one of those chapters in the uncanny. But one of the things that remains very suggestive and interesting for me in relation to Freud's reflections on déjà vu is the idea that it involves a suspension of judgment. What I referred to in the book as a trembling of belief. There's a kind of irreducible trembling of belief. What is happening? Is this, as it were, the same cat? Right? And that seemed to me like a very interesting moment in The Matrix, where that question, it haunts. And one of the ways in which it haunts, it seems to me, is in terms of the notion of resemblance. And I think the question of resemblance, which I was trying to, I suppose, evoke and to some extent sketch out in this little paper, is a sort of ghost in that moment in The Matrix. But it's one that, for me, becomes decisive for thinking about the relationship between writing and me, writing and the turning in the bed, as Lisa Robertson calls it, coming to consciousness. Yeah.
Can I just add, Nicholas, that I love the U-turn as well, and I don't think it's a terrible pun. I think it's a wonderful way to spatialize the relation between the I and the you in terms of what that resemblance actually looks like. Because the reason we make U-turns is because we've missed something, we've gone past something, but then you turn around and you can't actually get to where you started from. And so I think that the U-turn really encapsulates the front kind of way in which the I and the you don't actually ever converge, that I think is absolutely brilliant. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, perhaps I'll carry on thinking about it. Yeah. Thank you.
So we have a question in the back, then Julia, and then Marie.
Hi.
And we have 12 minutes.
Hi. So I have a question that I want to ask to all the three panelists. In a way, this is I think it's a bit of a too simplistic question, but I'm thinking a lot about what Lauren and your idea of the parafiction and the ways in which the lived experience of the I became very central to your project. And in Annabel's, I think, I'm not sure whether this was you were thinking, but I think you said at a certain point that for Carrera it became I was supposed to be like a platform for the others, but for Carrera it became like an extractive thing where he was manipulating the others for the construction of an I. And I'm in Nicholas, and I'm thinking how every I is already literary. I think that's sort of how you put it. So I wonder whether is the I, whether it's a pronoun, whether it's a narrating I, or whether it's the I of your project or I of the lived experience, is that I a destination, or is it like a layover or a stopover? I know this question sounds so metaphoric, but does it make sense? So is it sort of destination as in a place of arrival, or is it just a stopover, a layover? Yeah, so I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. I guess for Kara, or as you do your work as well, or in the literary objects that you engage with. Thank you.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. No, thank you for your question. It's a really interesting way to think about it, and it is neat to see these many questions that are engaging with movement as a way to think through these practices and genres. Whether the I is a destination or a stopover, I think for me, with the most recent research, the I was a starting point, so maybe like a kind of launching point, and then taking these other modes as the vehicle and kind of landing in a place that was a kind of transformed I, might be a way to think about it. Mm-hmm.
I think that what Carrera's I is for his readers who love him, of which there are very many, is kind of the equivalent of a Wawa, which I've never been to, but I've never been to a Wawa, but I know it because of its kind of cult reputation, right? People do pilgrimages to Wawa because they want to get like the Wawa sandwich or whatever. And I think that's kind of like that. You know, it's not a proper destination, but people have flocked to it because they think they can get everything that they need from it.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything actually to add. I suppose I was trying not to talk about me, or at least, you know, the hope was that in talking about you in the way that I was, something different might have opened up for thinking about I, but I don't think of I in terms of a destination or a stopover. I suppose I think of it in relation to veering. So a kind of open, uncertain movement that is not one of mastery, but of some kind of relinquishment of control.
Julia?
Thank you. I'm worried this is just the same question, actually. Okay, so it seems to me that this idea that there can be no fiction without telepathy seems to require two ontologically distinct subjects, right? Telepathy, I think, kind of necessitates that. Whereas, you know, often when we're talking about the inhabitants of fiction, some people will violently protest if you treat them as subject, as real in certain contexts, if you forget that, for example, fictional characters are not real people. A lot of people will get upset. Annabel, the slugs, you know, it's amazing. Like, if that's upsetting, I think not just because of the T-shirt I'm wearing, it is upsetting in a kind of Adornian vein, right? Which is like the kind of system of total monetized intimacy means that the sort of auratic alterity of the other is not possible, is foreclosed. And it seemed to me that sort of the reanimation of that, or the preservation of that possibility, is what you were talking about in your discussion of, for example, Marie's work. You know, this sort of feminine or feminized sphere of writing is doing this work of kind of prying open the distance between subjects, that the work that you're upset about is like smushing, slimily smushing closed. And so still there's this commitment to like two discrete, ontologically discrete, I want to say, subjects who kind of in some way ought or need to be kept separate, maybe in order for there to be a kind of legitimate communication between them. So then, Lauren, that makes me want to ask, and this is where I think it might just be the same question, but like, when you kind of let yourself dissolve into Saskatchewan's landscape and let your voice be altered into the matrix, and I guess I'm wondering, like, you know, also in relation to some of the sort of ethical imperatives that you remind us about when auto theory emerges, of like respecting the specificity of one's own discrete position and thinking about the difference of those to whom it's addressed or to whom it's not addressed or to whom it's not accessible. I guess I'm curious, if we were talking about being old post-structuralists yesterday, like, is there a value of a kind of dissolution of the subject? Like, I know this is something we're like tired of even thinking about, but like, is there anywhere in all this like a sort of like utopian possibility of a dissolve of the subject and of the relational into some like weird, gross, sluggy situation that would not be like ethically bankrupt? And can things like auto theory get us there? Or are we just like, no, we just know it's not possible, it's the wrong thing to want, like it's what, you know, theory wanted and they were wrong? You know, like how do we feel about that, I guess, with some of the modes that we're thinking about?
I think since that's a big question, we'll also take Marie's and let the panelists then speak, if that's okay.
I wonder if you should answer her first, because well, anyway, I was dreaming about the fact that the I may also be a U-turn. It's the place where you turn to because you forgot something or remember something. It's also the place where you address the you, the I. Well, the I is a U-turn. I like the idea. Annabel, it's true that Carrère and I are the best-selling authors of POL, this wonderful publishing company in France that is not in itself a best-selling company, but we are the two major authors. And it's very inspiring and funny for me to hear that in this context, the masculine is the real and the feminine is the fake, and it rings a bell. And I was wondering, Annabel, this is a bit silly, but are you aware of a French Parisian gossip about Emma Becker, the author Emma Becker, who she was a prostitute in a German prostituting company, je sais pas comment on appelle ça, a brothel, and she made a wonderful book called The House about that experience in her life. And then she wrote a second novel, un roman à clé entitled, if my memory is correct, L'Inconduite. Okay. In this novel, the young Emma Becker, the young I, the narrator, has an affair, a very erotic affair, with a famous French author. Okay. Name of the French author is Vincent. The agent of Emma Becker tried to advertise for the book, revealing that the French author was Emmanuel Carrère. And this agent of Emma Becker was one of the best friends in real life of Emmanuel Carrère. So he tried to create a literary gossipy event selling the truth. And in real life, it created chaos in the real life of the real Emmanuel Carrère, who happens to be a good relationship of mine, because his new partner was not aware of the affair with the young Emma Becker, of course. So the whole place in Paris was gossiping about Emmanuel Carrère's real life. Et c'est très compliqué. I think there is something in the French audience. For example, I was also in a cafe in Paris, in a terrace, and there were these two ladies talking about Emmanuel Carrère as if they knew him, and they actually wanted to have sex with him because he was so exciting, etc. And I think the French audience, Emmanuel Carrère belongs to his readers in a very, very strange way. I don't know what to do about all this, but you should have a look at Emma Becker and the gossip about.
I thank you for this, Marie, because I think you've just clarified for me what Emmanuel Carrère is to France, and he is part of a patrimoine public as a literary dildo.
But what do you do of Welbeck? Welbeck would be the dirty dildo, and Emmanuel the clean one?
Yeah, I think that's
something
right.
Emmanuel is fréquentable, and Welbeck is not.
It's a well-washed, sanitized, hygienic dildo, and Welbeck is the one you find in the corner, and you don't know who it was used by. And
I don't know. J'ai pas comme le vocabulaire pour tout comprendre. Mais
Elle dit qu'il y en a un qui est très désinfecté.
Ah oui, c'est ça.
Il est dans un coin et tu sais pas d'où il sort.
But it's true that as a woman, I'm spared the gossip. The only gossip that happens about me is when I have kids. Elle magazine, or Marie-Claire, the women magazine, they say, oh, Marie-Claire has a baby. But I'm never sadly, in the sexual or erotic gossip in Paris. I don't know why. Il y a quelque chose là.
Because there's a difference between an homme public and
une femme publique. Emma Becker was an ex-prostitute. C'est intéressant. Dans le fantasme de ce qu'est un écrivain et une écrivaine.
Okay, so we really have to wrap things up. So we'll allow Lauren and anybody else to say something in response to this question, and then come back and ask Annabel if you want to respond to that.
Sure. Yeah, Julie, thank you for your question. I mean, it occurs to me that maybe it's helpful to think about it dialectically. I wrote my t-shirt too. I mean, like, is there like a dialectic between the desire to escape, kind of expand beyond or dissolve the self, and to kind of sink into and better understand and return to the self? So, and it does feel like that's been part of all of the conversations the last 2 days. You know, whether the goal is the dissolution of the subject is really interesting. You know, thinking about it in the context of literature, thinking about it in the context of the world. You know, of course, for some people, that's a more readily accessible option. Others are more overdetermined by their subjectivity. Others still might want to kind of claim that subjectivity. I think of, you know, the kind of like dream of the 90s, like kind of like Gen X-y desire to like get past all difference, and you know, we're all like hands folding like around the world, and then I think of like kind of the generations below me or younger than me that I perceive like a kind of turn back to culture and reclaim like the specificity of one's like cultural identity and traditions, and as a kind of part of like another dialectic there. Yeah, so but I am curious at what others think, but I think thinking about dialectically is helpful for me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, no, I'm not interested in a dissolution of the subject or a slugfest. I think, you know, if I'm interested in anything in a catchphrase, I'm interested in psychedelic communism, and a new kind of psychedelic communism, which is in part the subject of my book about David Bowie and Sun Machine. Telepathy is a word that was invented in 1882, and originally the idea was, of course, of two ontologically discrete subjects, and the romantic notion of telepathy, the one that one kind of encounters in the writing of the Brontes, for instance, is clearly still very common and widespread and readily understood. But what interested me 35 years ago, when I was starting to work on telepathy and literature, was thinking about the idea of telepathy as a crisis of subjectivity, question of where does the subject begin or end in the telepathic scenario. I was translating Derrida's text, telepathy, and reading a lot of as much as I could around the question of telepathy. I cited Sartidia in the text that you heard, the idea of telepathy as a crisis of subjectivity, and all the systems deriving from it. Yeah, and for me, telepathy is really a word that has stayed with me as one I love, that is, I'm still trying to elaborate. It's about distance, it's about pain, suffering, it's about distant feeling and the relationship between minds. I don't really understand in a way why people have found it so difficult to get their heads around the idea that reading a novel is an exercise in mind reading. Because to me, it obviously is. It's all about some kind of experience of mind reading, and it is based on a structure which, you know, Tim talks about in the conventional sense, free indirect discourse, whatever we want to call it. It's about somebody claiming to know what somebody else is thinking and feeling, and you can't have a novel without something like that structure going on. So what happens if one stops using the conventional terms and tries to think perhaps in a different way? So that was really, that's why telepathy seems to me to be still interesting, worth thinking about.
And to respond to your question, Julia, thank you very much. For me, it's not really about maintaining two ontologically discrete subjects. It's really more that with what we get with a writer like Annabel is that it's just so methodically messy, right? Because he's refusing to keep distinct the extra-textual from the textual world, and that's what appeals. And so it's more about maintaining some real distinctions, despite the way we like to say that, you know, everything is fiction, but, you know, it's like there is a difference between the extra-textual and the textual world, the textual I and the extra-textual I. And that's what I'm seeing. Not so much about subjects, but about, I guess, the spaces in which the subjects are held, so that you're recognizing that one is kind of a virtual or a holographic subject versus this embodied, right? The embodiment is so important, real subject. And because for me, the novel, what makes it so precious and why I feel very protective about a very particular idea of the novel, which, full disclosure, I think the novel needs to go back to Fabulation and personality, but that's just me, is that it is a site of experience that doesn't need to be grounded, of kind of, and this is a fraught word, but for me it's a site of knowledge that's experiential without having to be empirical. And I think that's really important. And it's interesting to me that in the age of alternative facts and fake art, fake truth, or whatever, that's also coinciding with this kind of obsession with empiricism. In humanities especially too, as we are desperately trying to be relevant by making empirical terms.
Okay, well, let's thank our panelists once again for giving us the hour. I think 2 months to speak, and but I can speak first. Because I was just going to say that Tim, in his opening remarks, said that it was quite clear to us that this was a plurality that we were going to be talking about. So thank you to everybody who's contributed to that over the last couple of days. And also the idea that this would be an ongoing conversation. So an invitation to continue that immediately, just on a practical note, downstairs for a drink. For those who wish to follow 4 of our participants, reading at 7 o'clock and 20 stories. And thank you, a big thank you to the COVID staff, to Ben and to the participants, of course, and I'll let you take it.
I was just going to announce the reception, but then I was also going to say, what have we learned? And what we've learned is that every eye is, in fact, a story of you, that the subjective term, if you want to call it that, is equally and indiscernibly a reflection on the limitations of subjectivity. The deep earnestness on the part of a writer or a reader is no guarantee of truth. But it seems to me, I wanted to say, oh, the cat is now skinned, but it seems to me the cat is not skinned, which is an entirely good thing, as long as we are invoking as explanatory terms badness or narcissism or Donald Trump, the cat remains unskinned, which is, by the way, no bad thing at all. So, thanks to everybody. It's been a really fabulous.
And let's recognize Michelle and Kevin as well. That's our